Hello and welcome back to Kairos. It is a time to build up. I am Joshua Pfeiffer, your host here today with Kathleen Mills. Kathleen, welcome to Kairos.
Thanks so much, Joshua. I'm very excited to get a chance to speak with you today.
And we are excited to have you here. Kathleen is a trained deaconess, and so I wanted to talk to her today about deaconesses, what they do, where they come from, how they're trained, all these sorts of questions. And so really looking forward to the conversation today, Kathleen. Where are you coming from today, by the way?
So today, right now, coming to you from my home in Shepparton, Victoria, still working from home under government orders. So zooming in.
And just briefly, how has the year been for you in Victoria?
Oh, a whirlwind for sure. I know we thank everybody for their thoughts and prayers for the Victorian Church. We were under lockdown for a really long time and have spent the vast majority of this year, actually since I think the first week in Lent, doing remote learning, doing remote working, doing our services on YouTube. So quite a bit different than our standard procedure for sure.
Well, we're glad that you could find the time for us today in this crazy year that it's been, and perhaps we'll hear a little bit more later on about what that's actually looked like for you vocationally, serving as a deaconess in the church under those circumstances. Sure. So Kathleen, in the big picture, what do you usually say to people when they ask, what is a deaconess? Because I imagine when you get to know people, you get that question relatively often.
Absolutely. So I tell people that a deaconess is a woman who has undergone a time of training and formation in order to serve the church in a professional capacity. Mm-hmm. So when I say that I am a deaconess, it means that I am employed in full-time church work, and that the types of work that I do are related to the ministry of the church, but it is a kind of vast and varied vocational field.
Yeah, and so I imagine when you have those conversations that one of the questions that would often come up next is that people say, okay, that all sounds good, so what do you actually do? And so what are the sorts of things that deaconesses commonly do in their professional church work?
Sure. So there are a couple of different ways to describe this. I can explain it the way that training happens. We're trained in three main areas of service. Mm-hmm. Those are teaching the Christian faith, spiritual care, and works of mercy. In the history of the Lutheran Church in Australia, you talk about pastors having word and sacrament ministry. They described the deaconess ministry as a ministry of word and service, as opposed to word and sacrament. Mm-hmm. So the types of work that deaconesses do usually land kind of in one of those three overarching umbrella categories. So things like Sunday school and confirmation class fall into the teaching the faith category. And things like hospital visits and shut-in care and things like that under spiritual care. And then the big thing, probably the biggest change for me in terms of my daily life here in my work in Shepparton, is the mercy care. The meeting the physical, emotional, spiritual, you name it, needs of the people of God in the place where you're serving.
And I really want to come back to that to hear more about particularly what how you've been serving at Shepparton in these years that you've had. But probably by now, most of our listeners or watchers would have heard that you haven't got a normal Victorian accent. And so when you talk about your training, where were you trained in particular for your role as a deaconess?
Sure. So once again, that's a multiple choice answer. So I come out of the United States, out of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and I started my university training believing that I was going to be a Lutheran day school teacher. Mm-hmm. And so I went and I did my bachelor's studies at Concordia University in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And it was during my time there that the teaching field
ended up not being where I went, and I started preparing for going into deaconess ministry. So I did the start of my studies at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. And then I actually finished and got my certification through Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Okay.
So 3 different institutions over the course of about 9 years. It's not supposed to go that way. You can do it in 4 at a bachelor's level at Concordia River Forest or Chicago now. Or if you have a bachelor's degree in varied, there are options at both seminaries as well. And so I did the graduate level option.
Yeah, but whichever way you cut it, it's a significant course of training to become a deaconess from your church body.
It is, absolutely. So it is a matter of, we would call it formation, you know, not just training, but learning about what the office is and isn't, learning about all of the different parts of the way the church works, systematic theology and things like that, so that you know what you're preparing for, and then the settings into which you may be called.
And so was there something that particularly caused that change in direction for you when you're preparing to be a teacher and headed over towards the deaconess stream?
Yeah, it absolutely was. So I actually had spiritually and emotionally like a really hard time in university, and was not yet accepted into the teaching school of the university. And I had to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what's going on? And it was still relatively early in my training. I still needed some language requirement for my fine arts degree. And I took Spanish in high school, probably could have tested out. But I was like, nope, I just need to fill up my course hours with something. I'm going to do something new. I'll take Greek. That sounds fun. And sure enough, 7:30 in the morning, you know, getting up and hopping across campus to go into the Greek class with all guys who are pre-seminary, because those are the only people who take Greek. But it was an open class. And as I was taking that, I discovered that I really enjoyed it and was getting a lot out of it. And I spoke with my professor. I said, how can I use this? Like, what can I do with this? He says, well, there's actually a program starting out in the seminary that you might be interested in. And he was the one who actually directed me toward the deaconess program.
Okay. And when you spoke about the institutions that through which you did your training, I think it's particularly for people in Australia, it's worth just placing that in the context a bit. So there's this tertiary level of Lutheran education in the United States, which is where you started your degrees. But then you ended up going to both of the major seminaries. You correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. But what you're saying is that both of the major seminaries in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, which train all the pastors, also both have a program specifically for training deaconesses.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. And so it's really, I think it's a really worthwhile thing just to point that out, that this is an office in the church that is resourced and held in some esteem, and you're there at those institutions training side by side with future pastors.
Yes. And I think that that's one of the benefits. So I said, you know, when I was in university, my professor said it was just starting up. So the deaconesses had been trained at Concordia Chicago since 1980. And that was a bachelor's level program. And that's still going. You can still do that. But the seminary level training was relatively new when I began. I think, these are not the exact numbers, don't quote me. I think St. Louis started in 2002, and then Fort Wayne started in 2003. I think.
And so do you mind telling us just a little bit more about the training? So you mentioned Greek, systematic theology. What other parts of the training were there for your deaconess preparation?
So I'm a little bit unique with the language training. It's not a requirement for the deaconesses, even at the seminary level, although I did have some other sisters who did the same path as me.
You're just a sucker for punishment.
Yeah, I took Hebrew too, why not? So the basic kind of, if you had to say the root level training, is going to involve, like church history, exegesis. So everybody does exegetical theology, even if it's not in the original languages.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of the systematic stuff and practical stuff. So like in St. Louis, one of the classes that they had was called Pastor as Counselor, right? Mm-hmm. And it was a class about how to deal with different counseling situations that might walk into your office. Once the deaconess program began, it became pastor/deaconess as counselor, because that was a training area that related to both of the programs. And so those classes were mixed. And then we also had specifically courses on women in the church and courses on spiritual care of women, so that in a lot of, especially spiritual care situations, that's where a deaconess is really going to be kind of called into service and can kind of shine. Some situations where maybe a pastor would really want to elicit the assistance of a theologically trained woman to come alongside him with some of those types of situations.
Are there any examples of that sort of thing that you can share in general terms to get the sort of idea of things you might be talking about?
Yeah, so without disclosing anything, I can say that all of these things have happened in the course of my time as a deaconess. Family violence issues, a woman who's coming to talk about a problem, in her household. Youth issues around gender identity and sex before marriage and all of those things. And then, just environments where, something that's personally and emotionally connected to issues that women have and how that might be handled. Very similar to going to a doctor. Some women are fine. It doesn't matter what I'm going to the doctor for. I don't mind if my doctor is male or female. But there are some women who say, well, you know what, if it's going to be, I'm going to the doctor for things having to deal with the fact that I'm a woman, I would like that doctor to be a woman as well. The same happens in spiritual care sometimes.
That's a good analogy. And so they're doing your training, all these core areas and being prepared. And when you come to the end of your training, what happens with a deaconess? What's the language you use for completion and between that and getting to where you actually serve?
Sure. So similarly to how a pastor would go through training and then have a vicarage before he's completes his studies and he's ordained, a deaconess is going to go through her training, have an internship, and then in the language of the programs in the LCMS, would then be commissioned as a deaconess. So here in the Lutheran Church of Australia, you have pastors, you have clergy, and then you have lay workers, which is everybody else. In the LCMS, it's the same. We have ordained ministers who are pastors, and then we have commissioned ministers who are everybody else. So deaconesses are commissioned ministers. Lutheran day school teachers are commissioned ministers. Professional church musicians. We have an alphabet soup of different rostered lay workers, but they would all be called commissioned ministers.
And how common are the deaconesses in the church body from which you came? Like how many people would have been in your class and how many deaconesses might be around the place?
Sure. So relatively small, especially in comparison to some of the other fields of lay workers in America. So I'm sure there's thousands of day school teachers. There are over 6,000, I think I looked, pastors. And there are on the roster right now 318 deaconesses. So relatively tiny. So when an average class at St. Louis, I think, was 100 something for pastors, the number of students in my cohort was 9.
Yeah. And so you did your training and you were commissioned, and then where was next for you, Kathleen? And how did that work? Do you apply for roles, or was there a placement system, or did they use the language of calls, or what happened next for you?
So they do use the language of calls. And it could have been that what would happen is I would have finished my internship, and then I would have been presented to the board of presidents at the seminary with all the pastoral candidates, and they assign first calls. And call day is a big deal at both seminaries. And call day is for the ordained ministers and the commissioned ministers as well. My situation was unique. The internship that I actually finished on was the church that ended up calling me.
Okay.
So I didn't have to move. So I finished my internship, and then Fort Wayne did not have to find another place for me, because the church that I was serving, Concordia Lutheran Church in Columbus, Ohio, had me as their deaconess intern, and then it rolled right over into me being commissioned and being called to them.
And how long were you there for, and what was the focus of your work in that congregation?
Yep. So I was in Columbus at Concordia, including the internship, 7 years. So 6 years after after my training was over. And it was a youth and family ministry role. So doing things like the Children's Christmas program and the Lutheran Women's Missionary League group, and helping with confirmation class and all of those things, running the youth group.
And an enjoyable time there?
Yes. Oh, we loved it. And it was a smaller congregation. It was part-time, which served me very well, because we have 3 children who at the time of the internship were 9 months, a year and a half, and 3 roughly. So I needed to be at home and doing mom things sometimes. I needed to be at church doing church things sometimes. And that worked out really, really well for us. And yeah, we absolutely loved it there. Concordia is still, technically, according to my American residency, my home church.
Lovely. Okay. And thanks for mentioning your family context. I think that's a significant point to realize, that some people perhaps from different traditions, different church bodies, maybe think in, say, Roman Catholic terms, thinking about the service of different orders of nuns and that sort of thing. But of course, deaconesses marry and have children, and there's no, that I'm aware of, there's no history of particular vows going along with the deaconess movement in the same way that there have been in other traditions.
Yeah, not necessarily in the same way. I think earlier on, there may have been something in the Australian tradition that I'm not super aware of. And early on in the American tradition as well, deaconesses didn't get married. They lived in a deaconess house, and there was a deaconess mother, and they all lived together. And yeah, if they got married, they weren't a deaconess anymore.
Okay.
So, but that was true of teachers too, and all kinds of different, different vocations at the time, and that has changed. So yeah, now it is not a barrier to ministry to get married and have a family. It certainly did slow me down. It's why my training took like 9 years instead of 4 to 6. But wouldn't change it.
Yeah. No, the Apostle Paul's words, the married person is concerned with many things.
Yes, indeed.
And so, Kathleen, how on earth did you end up in Shepparton, Victoria? And for those who don't know, perhaps tell us, it's not as if Shepparton is a place that people from overseas often go, even if they do make it down to Australia. And so you haven't landed in a capital city in Australia, but far from it.
Yeah, so a long and sordid tale. So you have actually had Pastor Matt Anchor on Kairos in the past, and he told you a little bit of the Shepparton story. And it was during the course of the growth of the Shepparton congregation and the increase in the African immigrant population in Shepparton, and that then specifically in our congregation, in Shepparton, that they came to realize that there were a lot of ministry care needs that went along with that kind of influx. And we're talking about physical needs. People calling pastor because their alarm is going off or their pilot light for their hot water turned out and they don't know how to relight it. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn and saying that he was quite overwhelmed and just very burdened by having so much to do.
I've heard him say that publicly a number of times.
Yeah. And so when they started talking about building the church and things like that and seeking funding to build the new building, they reached out to the national office, to I believe the Board for Local Mission at the time. And they were like, look, we can't help you with funds for the building, but we could certainly help you get some help, get somebody to come alongside you and work with you. And that's where the idea of having a position of a lay worker of some sort began to take shape for this congregation. And a sister of mine, Deaconess Sandra, knows Pastor Matt because she does hymnal translations, and she had just finished one in Swahili. And she says, boy, it sounds like you need a deaconess. And so Pastor Matt reached out to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and was like, we kind of like one of those. Is there a way for us to get one of those? And as a deaconess, I was on the roster, we get emails, just like now in the LCA, I'll get emails if there's a lay worker position coming up. I would get emails, and I got an email that says there's a congregation looking to have a deaconess for 3 years in Shepparton, Victoria, Australia. And I read it and I said, oh, that'll be nice for some young single thing just starting out. And I closed it and I went on with my day. Until about 5 days later when I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I wrote the most sordid, crazy email to Pastor Matt going, I don't know why I'm writing to you. This is stupid. But if you're looking for somebody, what's it all about? If you're not looking for somebody, if 75 of my deaconess sisters have already applied to you and you're vetting candidates, forget I wrote. Like, you know, but what's going on? And he said, I'm happy to get your email, super happy. I have no applicants. Here's what's happening in my church. Please prayerfully consider. And it kind of went from there. Just a lot of phone conversations and Skype calls, a Skype interview with the call committee from the parish here. Some conversations with the LCMS, what that would all look like. And then finally, Pastor Matt came out to America for a week and did kind of final interviews and met with us just to make sure that, this is really what we were doing. And it became really clear. It took about a month and a half, 2 months from this is the craziest idea ever to this is unequivocally what God is calling our family to do.
Wow.
And then it took another 8 months, I think, to actually go through the whole process. So, okay, I'm doing it. They've offered the position to me. I've accepted it. Now I had to get a passport because I'd never been outside of the United States except for the Canada side of Niagara Falls when I was in 4th grade and you could get over there without a passport. And then the visa process and all of that. And once we finally got our visa, we'd been planning for it. We knew it was happening. The day our visa landed, I was like, I want to be flying in a month and a half. And we did it. We sold our house, we packed our stuff, and we came.
Wow.
That was in May of 2016, so we're just over 4 years now.
Okay, and how's it been? And what have you been doing in Shepparton?
It's amazing. We love it. So here in Shepparton, I'm still considered a youth and family ministry. So in that case, similar to what I was doing prior, I still do Sunday school. I still do confirmation class. I do the women's Bible study, but then just mercy care is really the letter of the day here. I remember telling Pastor Matt, he's, well, what do you do? And it's like, your job is word and sacrament ministry. That's what you're called to do. It's like, my job is everything else. We have people who need help getting a house to rent, and I help fill out rental applications. We have people who are looking for jobs, and I help them put their resumes together. We have people who need to go to Centerlink, and I drive them to Centerlink, and I sit in the Centerlink office with them. We have kids who are learning how to use computers so that they can do remote learning. And we have kids who, just want to come play soccer with some friends on a Friday night. And those are the types of things that I'm coordinating. And then also just kind of, especially recently since COVID, the kind of administrative tasks that go along with prepping worship. So I'll have a meeting with pastor and we'll talk about what we're going to do and which hymns and all of those things, and getting those sorts of things sorted as well. Booking people in for church, because you can only have thus and so many people inside, means making phone calls and saying, are you guys happy to come to the 10 a.m. service? How many of them there are you? And having it all ready to go.
Yeah, so we were talking briefly before we started today about your year so far, and so just for people out there, to give them the context of those comments, how long did you've only recently returned to any sort of public worship in Victoria, right? So how long were you recording and doing online stuff and all of that?
We have been recording since Lent, I think since like the second Sunday of Lent, and we are still planning to record for this coming Sunday.
So the whole of Lent, Easter, Pentecost, basically.
Yes. Yeah, it's been about 7 months.
A long time. Victorians have had the longest haul of this in Australia.
There was a brief stint, like in June, I think, where they started to kind of relax restrictions and everything. And I think we got up to like 20 inside. And that's when we started our first batch of like short communion services, just to try to get people, connecting face to face again. And that didn't last long at all. I think it was maybe a month or 5 weeks or something like that before the second wave started, and we had to lock that down.
And so just like pastors have had to adapt and be flexible in all sorts of ways this year, as a deaconess, you've done the same by the sounds of it, and been serving in ways you wouldn't have necessarily expected in the past. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've been using Zoom for our Bible studies, which has actually been probably one of the biggest blessings that we've gotten out of this, is that a lot of our parishioners really like that. And we do it at the parish level. So we actually have two congregations in our parish. We have the Shepparton congregation, and then we have another congregation in Echuca, about an hour away. And most of the work in the parish in terms of mercy care and things like that happen here in Shepparton. So I'm based almost solely here. But having the opportunity to do Bible study and everything with the Echuca folks has actually been really lovely. And we hope to continue it, even though we could get together and do it in person again. Everybody just really likes having that all together.
Yeah, that's one of the big questions for everyone now, is going forward, what do you keep and what do you...
Absolutely. What have you learned? How are you going to change? The other blessing is we are going to definitely still continue live streaming / recording services, because that has been a benefit for a lot of our parish members who are physically distant from either of our preaching locations, and find it hard to gather on a weekly basis. They have been thrilled that they're able to tune in to worship on YouTube and be able to have that connection. So it's going to continue even once we're back to worshiping full-time in person.
Kathleen, one of the things that you brought up a couple of times is the relationship between a deaconess and the pastor of the congregation, or pastors in some cases, I suppose. And just wondering whether you'd like to say any more about that, or when people might ask you, how would you describe the relationship between a deaconess and a pastor? How's that supposed to work? What would you say?
Yeah, I would say that the office of deaconess, is an auxiliary office to the office of the public ministry. And in that way, there are many cases in a lot of different congregations where the pastor ends up being the direct supervisor, if you will, from an administrative standpoint, of the deaconess. I think in our congregation, I'm answerable to the church council. But more often than not, I'm talking with pastor, and then pastor reports to church council. I'm present at those. But in terms of the working relationship between the two of us, it is a recognition that we are united in service to our Lord and his church in the place that he's called us to be. And we work very closely with one another in terms of how those different ministry areas are carried out.
And thanks for that's a really helpful description. And one of the reasons that I ask as well, and I have in the back of my mind, is that you've also referenced the Australian history here. That there's our own history of deaconesses in our own church, and I know from speaking with some of those women or reading their stories that this was sometimes part of the tension and the challenge for some deaconesses, is that perhaps they didn't always feel valued by their pastor, or perhaps some of the best construction is that pastors often didn't know what to do with them, and didn't know how to use them and help equip them well and serve in complementary ways. But for you, has that relationship generally been positive, or have there been challenges there for you as well, working with pastors?
So I have been absolutely 100% blessed in this regard. So I have had 2 calls, the one in Columbus and this one. This is my second, this is the first time I've moved ministries. And in both of those places, I have served under 2 pastors. So the pastor I came in under in Columbus took another call, and they were like, "Oh, Kathleen, we're so happy you're here. You can help us with the transition to a new pastor." And the new pastor came in, helping him start well, you know, and developing that team ministry relationship between the 2 of us. And both of them were awesome. I love them. And then I came here, worked under Pastor Matt, and then he's like, "Hey, taking a call." And we're really happy you're here, Kathleen, because it'll be great to have you here for the transition to new pastor. And Pastor Matthias came after a blessedly very short vacancy, and you know, helping him start well. And he's come from other team ministry situations, so he had no qualms at all, kind of sliding right into that. And it's been an absolute blessing. Yeah, no, I personally have heard all of the stories that you have heard, and have heard similar stories, you know, in America as well. But have been blessed personally to not have to deal with any of it.
And just connecting some of the dots of our small circles, Pastor Matthias, when he went to the call there, I came into the role in which he was in the call here in the Bethlehem congregation. So it's a small little network, our church.
Yes.
And so just reflecting on that a little bit further, Kathleen, so what is it that has made it positive for you from the pastors and congregations perspective? Or another way to ask the question might be to say, how can pastors or congregations best utilize, receive the blessing that is a deaconess? How can we avoid those sorts of problems that have cropped up in the past, do you think?
So I guess I think it is just a recognition of the office, of what it is. And then, yeah, just a willingness to have a partner in that way. So, I mean, and I've heard my little bits and pieces of stuff. Like I remember, you know, one time one of the older gentlemen in one of the congregations being like, "Oh, well, you know, who's babysitting your kids while you're here doing evening Bibles class?" You know, and it's like, my husband, who does not babysit his own children, he parents his children while I'm at work, just like I parent our children when he's at work. You know, and things like that. But there are certainly things that I do that there are hundreds and thousands of very dedicated church secretaries do. You know, but it's not just that. There are things that I do that come alongside with what our volunteer Sunday school superintendents do. But it's more than that. You know, just a recognition that we do have this training, and we do have the formation that allows us to come along and serve in that kind of whatever you need way that I mentioned before. And having the benefit of having somebody who has that theological training, who has that, you know, and trust. Like all of my pastors have been really comfortable in trusting me with things, right? They don't need to kind of hover over and make sure I'm doing it the way they would like. They were comfortable with like, you take that and you go, you know. You know, are in a hospital situation,
there's the blessing of the office again. So, I'm wearing this uniform for you today.
Yeah.
This is the official uniform of the Concordia Deaconess Conference, which is an association of deaconesses in the Lutheran Church of Missouri Synod.
Okay.
And it's all I've got. Can I get me one of these? I don't know. This is what deaconesses look like, back in the 40s and 50s here in Australia. But
yes.
The idea of garb, of a uniform. Just for pastors, you wear your clerical. You're not too worried about it at Woolies, but you're worried about it when you go into a hospital because you're there for spiritual care, and it helps the hospital staff to identify that. This is the same way. I can go visit somebody, but if I go in my garb, it's a recognition of what I'm there to do. It is a reminder of the service role that I'm stepping into, right? But then it is also just, an outward indicator to those around me that I'm here for a spiritual purpose.
Kathleen, what would you say have been the biggest challenges in your time serving as a deaconess?
I would say that this is a personal challenge, not necessarily one inherent to the office. It is work-life balance, and that's been heaps worse since COVID. Just that recognition of my different vocations, my multiple vocations as wife, as mom, as deaconess, and being allowed to kind of split those out and separate them, and let one take precedence when it has to, is hard for me.
And thank you for sharing that. I wonder whether there is something inherent to the office about with that challenge, though, just because it seems to me that the service of deaconesses can be so broad and varied, and they have this wonderful servant heart that's willing to plug gaps, so to speak, and to help out in so many different ways, that I can imagine how that could potentially lend itself to this being an ongoing challenge for many deaconesses.
Yeah. We went home to the US for a holiday last year. I did get one messenger call from a parishioner while I was in the US, and I had to be like, I'm super sorry, but I am on leave and I'm not even on the same continent as you, and please call someone else. But as a general rule, and that's all a recognition of building, what it looks like. So I have a regular work week. Or did before I brought it all home. Thursday is my regular day off, and the congregation is aware of that and has kind of slid into being comfortable about that. And I intentionally take a different day off from pastor so that somebody is available. So guarding my time and getting better at it. I have been very blessed that my pastors have been like, hey, when are you going to take leave? Get out of here, go do something. They're aware of that too. And this year in particular, it's just been,
everything's blurred even more. And
I
heard one of the words of the year is Blur's Day, that feeling of not knowing what day it is in lockdown. I just read this in the paper this weekend.
Yeah, I missed one of the Bible studies on Zoom because I was just chilling watching TV with my daughter because I was like, I don't know, it's fine. And then halfway through, or 20 minutes after, I think it might have been after Bible study, I get a text from pastor. He's like, you okay? I'm like, yeah, what's going on? And he's like, Bible study? I'm like, oh, it's Thursday.
It's
and
Blur's Day.
He recorded it, and it was Blur's Day. Oh yeah, for sure.
And what have been the biggest joys for you, Kathleen, in your service as a deaconess?
Oh, the people. Just loving on God's people and just being able to be in that community. A recognition, I get to, and Shepparton is just particularly gifted in that regard. All of our people just have an incredible gift for hospitality, and children, I wasn't even here a week. I was brand new. They didn't know who I was, but kids would crawl up into my lap and play with my hair. They didn't care. They're like, oh yeah, she's from church, she's fine. And just being invited into all these families and getting to know all of them, and just sharing that reality of the body of Christ in such a personal way. here in Shepparton, in addition to the gift of hospitality, our particularly African members don't dissociate and compartmentalize their lives kind of the way Western minds do. Church life isn't something that just happens on Sunday and then they do something else the rest of the week and then they come back on Sunday. It is part of their lives in a very normal way. And that does mean that when they need help, right, the first place they go is the church. That's completely natural to them. Whereas a lot of us kind of grew up very individualistic in kind of Western cultures, and I don't need to trouble the church or let anybody know, what's going on in my home life, because that's not what they're there for. It is absolutely 100% what we're here for. And it's a blessing to be able to serve people in that way. And so, like I said, that mercy care, that being and walking alongside someone when they're struggling in some way, is the way the body of Christ walks together, and it's just so beautifully on display here.
And I do encourage people, if you want some more of the context of the Shepparton story, to look at that video or listen to that podcast that I did with Pastor Anchor, where he tells the whole story. It really is quite something. And if you're intrigued by what Kathleen is saying, you can get a bit more of the picture filled out from that conversation. Kathleen, how much longer do we have you here in Australia for? How did your call work here? Are you seconded, or do you have an appointment?
Yeah.
Are you here because of COVID?
It is at God's mercy and no idea. So when I came, I ended up not being seconded or called directly by the LCMS. It was just the way everything sorted itself out. We opted to say we are coming to Australia kind of on our own.
Yep.
I have spoken with my deaconess sisters, like I'm still part of the CDC.
Yep.
And in terms of the LCMS, I'm still a commissioned minister. I'm on what they call candidate status, which means I'm not actively serving in a call right now. And if when we go back to America, I can contact them and say, hey, I'm back in the country and I'm eligible to receive a call. And that's how I would end up being active on the roster again in America. In terms of my position here, it's like this is really my whole life, actually, not just the two countries from a church perspective. But so here, I am a member of the Lutheran Church of Australia. I'm a member of St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Shepparton. And I am a rostered lay worker in the Lutheran Church of Australia. And that's the capacity under which I serve. And that was supposed to be a 3-year term when we accepted the position.
Yeah.
And it was 2 years and 6 months, I think, about into that 3 years when Pastor Matt took the call to the national office. So as part of that process, they offered to extend the appointment for a further 3 years, which I accepted. So now I'm in 4 years of 6.
Okay.
The Lord knows what will happen after that. And he'll let me know if and when there needs to be a change. Because I certainly never expected that I would be serving in Australia. When my husband and I got engaged, I remember telling him, I was like, marrying a full-time church worker means you could get called somewhere weird, right? And I thought I meant like Iowa. But my husband is wonderful, and is a go with the flow kind of dude. And he's like, I read it to him, the email asking for a deaconess here. And he's like, that'd be cool. That'd be an adventure.
Yeah.
That would be good for our kids. You should look into that. His encouragement and support is what allows me to, be able to be mom and deaconess, even on a different continent.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad we still have you here in Lutheran Church of Australia, Kathleen, and we wish you and your family every blessing. Just as we begin to wrap up, the last question I just was come to mind as you were speaking was, if there is a young woman out there who has this heart for service, perhaps in the United States where there are these opportunities for deaconess programs, or here in Australia we don't officially have this sort of track at the moment, but of course there's always opportunities to study theology, to go that bit deeper and look for those opportunities, for there's many opportunities for full-time or part-time professional church service. Do you have any words of encouragement for a young woman in particular who has that heart, and about where they should channel that desire and how they should go about it?
Yeah. First place I would send that woman is to next of kin. Talk to your parents if you're young and still in high school. Talk to your husband if you're married, about those sorts of things. Talk to your pastor. There may be opportunities for service, even just on a volunteer basis to start, or something within your congregation that you're not aware of. Go and study and be faithful in your study of the Word, and in prayer, and in asking God, I want to serve. This is, I should totally share that with you. Bring me back to the True Deaconess Spirit by Wilhelm Lohe. If I want to serve, what is that? What is it that God is pointing me toward? Seek that out and talk to people about it. And then, there are plenty of opportunities. I know that ALC here in Australia, to do a theology degree is a different stream than doing like a pastoral degree. Like, anybody can go study theology. If you have an interest and a desire for that, go for it. If you want to go study Greek, it's cool. Like,
it is.
It is. I'm super rusty. Don't ask me to translate anything or do any declensions on the spot.
That's all good advice.
If you wish to serve, God has a place for you to do that, and ask Him to show you where it is.
Yeah, that's very wise advice. Thank you for that. And Wilhelm Lohe?
Yeah, kind of the pioneer of the deaconess ministry in the Lutheran Church, both in Australia and in America. Both kind of come out of Germany, and the training programs and all of that were pretty similar, kind of all the way through. And he wrote this poem called "The True Deaconess Spirit." It is used in like the commissioning service, and the pinning ceremony as part of becoming a deaconess in America. And I know that they're familiar with it here too. And some of you might know Deaconess Faye, who came to Shepparton and was here for my installation in the Shepparton congregation and shared this with me as part of the installation, right? He says, "What is my want? I want to serve. Whom do I want to serve? My Lord and his wretched ones and his poor. And what is my reward? I serve neither for reward nor thanks, but out of gratitude and love. My reward is that I am permitted to serve. If I should perish in this service, if I perish, I perish, said Queen Esther. I would give myself for him who gave himself for me, but he will not let me perish. And if I grow old in this service, then shall my heart be renewed as a palm tree, and the Lord shall satisfy me with grace and mercy. I go my way in peace, casting all my care upon him."
Well, I can't think of a better place to end for today than that, Kathleen. So thank you very much for sharing Lohe's poem, and thank you for your time today, and for your service in the Lord's Church as a deaconess, and for your contribution to Kairos today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Next time in Adelaide.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think the other borders open at the moment. It depends what day of the week it is,
Yeah. And are they open, or are they open to Victoria? Are usually two different questions right now as well.
Yes, that's right.
We're getting there. We're getting there.
We are.
And hopefully free to move around a bit more soon. That's
right. Well, thank you again, Deaconess Kathleen, and God's blessings to you.
Thanks so much, Josh. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.